So the next thing I want to talk about, I actually want to make this one go really quickly, but it can't be all sports all the time, and it kind of feels over the last little while like like it's been mostly sports. That's really just kind of mostly what I've found interesting lately. But I want to take a minute to talk about this new Mortal Kombat movie, or even to talk about Mortal Kombat a little bit more in general. Now, Mortal Kombat is a video game franchise that I grew up with. I think the first one might have come out when I was 11 or 12. And so that was a huge, huge deal at the time. You know, for like a video game with actual blood and death in it. Today that is incredibly common. I mean, video games obviously just are not just for kids anymore. But all the way back then, this was like a new and shocking thing. You know, so much so that when it finally made it to the home consoles, they actually had to edit the first game. You know, there was no blood in the first game unless you had the Sega Genesis, and unless you happened to have the blood code, which I believe, if I'm not mistaken, somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it was BABACC start, something like that. And then, of course, it would activate the blood and all of the fatalities and everything. The Super Nintendo version of the game never did have that blood code. There was a rumor that it had it, but unfortunately it never did. But as shocking as it was at the time, I mean, if you were ever concerned about the cultural impact of the game, you know, the people that were outraged about there being blood in the game, you know, they were paying attention to exactly the wrong thing. You know, if you were, if you wanted to be a cultural Karen, so to speak, and at the time, actually, I even kind of felt this way myself too. But if you wanted to get into that kind of, that level of concern and that level of behavior, really, I think that what people should have actually paid attention to was the character Sub-Zero, and the way that Sub-Zero was received by fans the first time that the game came out. And so, for those of you who may not be aware of the Sub-Zero story as it originally appeared in the video games, because it's been done and redone a number of times, and actually with good reason, which I'll get to in a minute. But the original Sub-Zero origin was basically that Sub-Zero was a ruthless murderer. You know, he was a murderer of women and children. In fact, that was why he and Scorpion were enemies in the game, was because Sub-Zero had not only murdered Scorpion in life, but he had actually murdered his wife and his child as well. Which is something that, of course, you do see early on in the movie. It's not really very much of a spoiler. It's literally the first thing that's there. And in fact, I think that they even put that out as a YouTube clip. So that's not really any kind of a spoiler. I'm going to try to not spoil the movie for anybody who hasn't had an opportunity to see it yet. Anyway, but moving along. And so Scorpion goes into the afterlife, and then he comes back as like this almost like undead, almost like a zombie type character. If he takes off his mask, there's just a skull there. He doesn't have a human face. And his mission in the game is to get revenge on Sub-Zero. And in all honesty, he should get revenge on Sub-Zero. Guy's a woman murderer. He's a child murderer. And yet, for some reason, Sub-Zero was actually accepted very positively by the fans. For a lot of people that I knew, Sub-Zero was their favorite character. And I suppose it did make a certain degree of sense. He had the coolest powers in the game. Literally and figuratively, he did have the coolest powers. He had the coolest moves. He could freeze you. His fatality, as I recall, that he would actually freeze you, and then he would freeze you solid and then shatter your body. I have to admit, that is a pretty cool little fatality move. But to get behind that character as a fan, you basically have to not care that he murders women and children. I don't think that really said very good things about what the culture was starting to turn to at the time. It was the 90s. It was edgier. People were more cynical, even more so than they are now. But I think even the game developers at Midway actually eventually clued into the idea that, hey, you know what? We might have a little bit of a problem here with how popular this character is. I get the sense that maybe he was never intended to be that popular. I mean, they did, as any good business really should do if you have an asset like that, they did capitalize it. They did capitalize on it. But another thing they did was they kind of shifted the narrative around the character a little bit. And so what they did was that as later versions of the game came out, eventually in the what you would call the game's canon, so to speak. I mean, if you could even apply such a such a concept to Mortal Kombat, because it's been all over the place and changed so much. But eventually, what they did do with that game was they had Scorpion kill the original Sub-Zero, and then the Sub-Zero that appeared in later games was actually the brother of the original Sub-Zero, who was actually innocent of any kind of wrongdoing, and when he learned about his brother's actions, actually wound up kind of turning his back, on his brother's memory, and then abandoning his Sub-Zero costume, and he had his own completely different, still blue costume. And so what the writers of Midway kind of did was they said to themselves, I think that we might actually be in, from the storytelling perspective, in kind of like an ethically shaky kind of spot here, and they did a course correction. And that course correction actually held true into this most recent movie. And of all the things that I will say about it, I'm going to try to not say a whole lot about the plot, anything like that might actually spoil the movie. But I mean, of course, obviously Sub-Zero is a very important part of the movie. And one thing that they managed to do in this movie, compared to the original one, I mean, all the way back in, God, when did that movie come out? It must have been 1994, maybe? If I'm wrong about that, please correct me. But in that movie, I mean, Sub-Zero was in the movie, but he was just kind of like a henchman. Not really a very important part of the movie. In the new movie, he is a very important part of the movie, and he's actually this really menacing villain that kind of stalks the characters throughout the course of the movie. They did a really good job getting this one exactly right. And as much as I would like to tell you just how much exactly right they did eventually, they did get this character this time around. I can't do that without spoiling the movie. So if you do happen to be in a place where movie theaters are actually still open, sorry, Alberta, but in Saskatchewan, at least when I left Saskatchewan to come to my quote-unquote undisclosed location, which is not witness protection, movie theaters are still open in Saskatchewan. So if you are in Saskatchewan, you can still go see this movie. Please do. Because movie theaters have had a hard time with this pandemic, as hard as absolutely everybody else. So, go out. If you were a fan of this franchise, go out, see this movie, have a good time, support your local movie theater. It might be tempting to stay home and just watch it on HBO Max, but, Warner Brothers and HBO Max, they're going to do fine on this movie. Go out and help some of the people that have been providing entertainment in your communities, in some cases for decades. Go see this movie. Go give them a hand. It's a really good film. If you liked the video games, you're gonna like it. You're at the very least going to walk away satisfied.